fine washables.
Coming up next, Webster.
Good morning. Back to the nation's business with a vengeance this morning. A gaggle of distinguished politicians. Fortunately for you and for me, one at a time. The first man I'm going to introduce is not actually now a politician. It's Paul Hellyer. Remember Paul Hellyer, Liberal Defence Minister, responsible for unification, Action Canada, now a distinguished columnist on the Toronto Sun, and he's got the arrogance to think that he's got the answer to inflation. Can you imagine that? We all know it can't be cured. In the studio this morning too, and perhaps she'll tell me something about the turmoil in the Tories. Oh, I don't like that surrounding orange. Is Jean Piggott. She was the appointments boss under the short-lived, we always say short-lived Clark government, and Joe's got his problems now. But first off at top this morning, we're going to have that charming French-Canadian politician, Jean-Luc Pepin. Jean-Luc is a poor guy who's trying to salvage Mirabel Airport on taking the heat and burden on the day on slashing Via Rail. Whatever became of the CPR's franchise to supply efficient rail service forever in return for the land grants? And of course, the Libs have their problems too, vis-a-vis Jimmy Coots and company. First, Jean-Luc Pepin, after the break. A Conservative Party task force headed by Don Mazankowski opens hearings in Vancouver tomorrow on what the Liberal government is doing to Via Rail. By coincidence, Jean-Luc Pepin, the Minister of Transport, is in Vancouver for a ports conference of some description. Mr. Pepin, I don't see much hysteria yet in the cutbacks on the western regions of Via Rail, but succinctly, you've taken out one of the transcontinentals altogether, and you're going to let us limp along with one transcontinental service. Is that correct?
Well, that's partly correct, but let's bear in mind that the big deficit is on the transcontinental. About $165 million of the $350 million on operation deficit of VIA this time is on the transcontinental. But what we're doing is keeping one transcontinental, the southern one, the one that goes through Calgary, and with respect to the northern one, we divide it in pieces according to the general policy of the theme of the policies that I've announced. That is that the best place for rail transportation for passengers now is in the intercity. So the northern transcontinental now is divided. It has a Winnipeg, Regina, Saskatoon wing and a Saskatoon, Edmonton. And unfortunately, this is the problem you're going to raise. It doesn't have a Jasper to Vancouver section.
Well, you know, I got to go back to the days when we were all convinced that there was a conspiracy by the railroads, particularly the CPR, to downgrade the passenger service, to get rid of it, to carry the much more revenue-producing product. That was correct, wasn't it?
No, it wasn't correct. If you
Certainly looked like it, didn't it?
If you remember, if you recall what you've lived through in the last 25 years, for example, you and I and everybody here has lived through 3 revolutions. You've lived through the revolution of the passenger, the private automobile, right? It became very important. 88% of people who travel more than 50 miles at this time do it by their private automobile. Now, you witness another revolution, which is the revolution of the bus. And you've witnessed a third revolution, which is the revolution of the airplane.
And here we are right now, going back to light rail rapid transit intercity in Vancouver.
You're talking intra-city, you're not talking intercity.
We don't have any intercity when here except
No, but that's a different pair of shoes.
line.
That's a different pair of shoes. But you do recognize that you've lived through those three revolutions, and then my question is to you, how can the railways, which used to be the preeminent transportation method or mode, how can it go through those three revolutions without adjusting? Now, every report that you will read, every speech made by ministers of transport who dare make some, and Paul Hellyer did, will tell you for the last 30 years that we have to adjust to those changes. And this adjustment will take place anyway. What I'm saying is let's adjust in a systematic way, in a way that will economize money.
What did you say the deficit was on the transcontinental, the northern line?
165. Half of the $350 million on operation now.
How much are you down in the hole on Mirabel, that great white elephant of the Liberal Party?
I don't expect something so irrational from you. You know, are we going to recommend that we make mistakes systematically? Mistakes are made. You've made a few, very, very few, I'm
Can't
sure.
remember.
You can't remember. No. You've forgotten. That's very convenient.
Anyway, I wanted to nag you about Mirabel because that is really a white elephant, isn't it?
No, that's not a pair of shoes. Well, but Jack, this is the problem. I'm wearing a cap now. You don't see it? I'm wearing a cap.
I see a halo.
The cap says, well, put what I'm going to say on the halo.
Right.
The cap says, $500 million. That's all I have. Okay? $500 million. Do you realize that $500 million is spent on VIA? Now you realize that.
Subsidy.
Subsidy. It means that each time a passenger buys a ticket, as an average, the Department of Transport pays $70. Each time you buy a ticket on the Transcontinental, the Department of Transport pays $160. Okay? Now, the choice I have, this being capped, red capped, okay? The choice I have is how is the money going to be spent? We can continue to add on operation deficits, right? We're up to 350, we can go up to 400, we can go up to 450. But the decision was made was, taking this cap in mind, that we would freeze the deficit on operations at 350,
right,
and we would move the money from the deficit on operations to the capital budget. And that is what is being done. VIA at $90 million this year to buy equipment. By 2 years from now, it will have 182. So then VIA will be given the equipment, will be given the means to do a better job of it. But in order to do that, you've got to eliminate or reduce some of the lines that have no reason to be there.
You're slashing some of your transcontinental, you're going to improve the intercity services, but
yeah, and the transcontinental that is left.
You're doing this at a time when your 88% of motorists are faced with down the road $5 gas, $4 gas, $3.50 gas. Surely the entire trend in transportation, apart from air and some bus, has got to be rail rapid transit.
And that's unfortunately not true. You may believe that. It's a good dream to have. You may believe that railway is going to return someday, and consequently that we should keep on raising the subsidy to railways. Well, this is not the trend in any part of the world that is known, okay? In every part of the world, the trend is toward more automobile, more private automobile, more buses, more airlines, and not towards more people traveling by train.
Even in Europe?
Even in Japan, even in Europe. That's not the trend. If you go to Europe, you'll realize what is happening there. As people get more and more comfortably financially, they buy more and more automobile. And the $4 gallon thing doesn't seem to have a direct effect on their traveling habits.
Look what's happening in Vancouver now. We're buying your Ontario equipment for light rapid transit. We're not going to put in all the big freeways. We're going to be forced into light rail rapid transit.
Well,
is that not good?
But if the dream that you have, that because of those factors that you mentioned, railways will come back, if that were true, maybe it would influence us now at this point. But should it be true, Jack, should it be true, the lines will be there still for carrying freight. So we could resume our dependence on railway to a greater extent, should the dream that you have in mind.
Why don't you
ever
go to this
realize.
Tory task force and take the spotlight away from them and tell them what you believe is the facts of life?
Well, I'll have plenty of opportunity to do that. I'm doing it this morning. I've done it a number of times already, and there's no doubt that there's going to be a very, very good debate in the House of Commons when we open on the 14th of
debate, because
October.
you Liberals will do what you want anyway, providing you have
No,
a
but
majority.
I can't prevent a debate, can I?
No, you can't prevent a debate, but you can always have closure.
But what I'm going to do, though, is explain all these budgetary considerations that you make the case in historical terms that every study that has been made in Canada worth its investment comes to the same conclusion that you have to rationalize passenger transportation.
One question, when do the Winnipeg, Saskatchewan, Edmonton, Vancouver links, are they dead already?
No,
Because you made an arbitrary decision, I just remembered, without any public hearing.
You're right.
That's appalling.
No. Can I explain that? You get some
You
more
can
time?
after the break.
Okay.
Jean-Luc Pepin, the Minister of Transport, looks after grain, airports, ports, air traffic controllers, railways, and of course he's so busy they didn't have time for public hearings to try and slash the deficit of the Via Rail.
Okay, let me tackle you on that one. All right. All these lines that have been eliminated or reduced now have been studied in the past by the Canadian Transportation Commission. They've all been studied. And they've been the object of decisions by that commission. Now, it's a hodgepodge affair. Section 64 of the National Transportation Act specifically says that at times the government will be entitled to come in and do a total job of it. And that is what is needed now. You can't go simply checking on line route X, Y, Z, and whatnot. You've got to do a total job of it. And this is why the law, which is not an ass, the law said the government at times can do that and authorizes it to do that. Now, Jack, the only other way to go about it would have been to go and tell the CTC, now you do the job of inquiry, but from now on, you are also capped the same way as the minister is capped. And your decisions added up will have to amount to $500 million a year.
Wouldn't they have done it?
They would have done the same thing I'm doing now.
Why didn't you let them do it and take the heat off you?
Because it would have taken 3, 4, 5 years to do that with uncertain results. And in the meantime, we would have not saved the $100 million which is needed to buy the new equipment, the LRC, so that Western Canada and the Atlantic provinces in 2 years' time will also have their LRC.
Oh, I agree with you. There are times when arbitrary action by the minister responsible is better than 4 years of feather bedding by bureaucrats.
Especially when the law authorizes the minister to do that. There's nothing illegal in what I'm doing now.
Have you had much of a public outcry from the West?
So, you know, I had editorials which are really extraordinary. One of them says that the basis of what the department and the minister are doing now is all right. Unfortunately, the method that he is using is not very good, though we agree that they have no choice at all. You know, that a lot of people are quite ambivalent these times as to this change.
Your mind is made up. Nothing will change it. None of the Tory protests will have the slightest decision on your findings.
You know how kind I am. So don't ask me to say anything naughty about the Tory process on this subject.
Just while we're on that subject, just to lighten up the program, we all had a great giggle when Coots was defeated. Did you not have a little snicker yourself when the fair-haired, chubby-cheeked boy was parachuted into the safest riding in the country, and whammo, the cutting
well, it's not the first time it arrives. It happens. But I was sad. You know why?
Why?
I'm a good friend.
A backroom boy thrown into a ready-made seat?
But I'm a political scientist. You're aware of the fact that I taught political science for a decade. It would have been interesting, wouldn't that, Jack?
Was it you
to see a guy moving from the back room to the front room?
You know what really gets me about you?
It would have been very interesting. You and I, you would have had him on this program regularly for years.
You know what gets me about you Liberals? It's your cold-blooded arrogance. You take that fellow, that Stollier, what was his name? Peter Stollery.
Yeah.
Peter Stollery. He's only been in the House a year?
No. He had been much longer than that.
Much longer than that?
Yes, yeah.
Senate.
Senate.
Just wham, bam into the Senate, a young politician. That's cold-blooded. To make room for Coots.
Well, he was as good as many who are there now, isn't he? Well, come on.
You're not by any chance disparaging the upper house, are you?
I'm not a great fan of that institution. I'm sorry. I'm on record. I've written articles on it 20 years ago, and which are always quoted back at me when I talk about the subject.
The Canadian Air Traffic...
But to come back to Jimmy Coots, I think it's sad. I'm sad.
He's
really,
finished now,
genuinely. I don't know. Who knows about these things? But it would have been a very interesting phenomenon to observe for thinking people like yourself.
Well, we did
to
this.
see our guy move from the back room to the front
you
room.
would think you'd
and it
have-
would have been highly desirable, and I think he would have done well.
You would have think you'd have learned your lesson
bad.
way back
Tough
from
luck.
the old days of Tom Kent, you know, one of your great liberal bureaucrats. He came out here and we cut his throat when he tried to cut the feet away from wee Tommy Douglas, which couldn't be done.
Have you got another subject to bring up?
If you stop talking for a minute, I'll ask you. Serious question. I don't think it's funny. Nobody will give me a Senate seat forever.
You jealous? Or?
Well, you know, after all, one can go through life on the Senate most enjoyably. I have a number of friends who are there and just love it when they go. Canadian air traffic controllers, to be deadly serious. I want to know who is in command of an aircraft, a Canadian aircraft in Canadian skies. Is it a pilot, or is it the air traffic controllers?
The pilot. But the air traffic controllers in Canada, as well as everywhere else in the world, have been trying in recent years to upgrade their status by saying that they're quite as important as pilot in terms of safety of the passenger.
Are we going?
And consequently, Jack, this is international. I've been demanding equal salary to the pilot, and that, in a nutshell, is the problem you have now here in Canada and elsewhere.
As of
Equity
this
with the
moment,
pilot.
they're only at about 1/3 of the pilot salary levels.
About that, I would think.
Do you plan to accede to their position? Are you going to give them the money?
Well, you'll see that the negotiation is beginning in a few days' time now, and the government will come with a position on the subject, and hopefully it will be palatable to them. I'm not in a position this morning to reveal what it would be.
Well, it's good to hear you say that that is their specific demand, because the pilots have been very slow in backing. In fact, they haven't backed the air traffic controllers' complaints about cross-the-border traffic between here and Seattle, for instance. So it's a very tricky situation we face.
Yeah. It's a very tricky, a very frightening one. You know, there are 50-50 chance that we'll be confronted with the possibility of a strike again in a few weeks' time. So this is a fact. These gentlemen, the controllers, feel that they're not adequately paid, not adequately treated, and throughout the world, there's an international movement towards that end. They've decided that they were going to work for parity with pilots.
Jean-Luc Pepin says there's a possibility of an air traffic controller strike in Canada.
Sure.
Are the skies that much less safe because of this tension?
Well, the tension is so regular that you think that it has become institutionalized the way you have become. No, but that tension has been with us now. Can you remember a time when we had peace in the towers of the nation? No, because this recrimination of theirs has been with us now for a great number of years.
Jean-Luc Pepin.
When they're not complaining about the time, the overtime, they're complaining about the equipment. When it's not about the equipment, it's the stress. When it's not about that. But this is again, there's a book on the subject, you may have read about it.
The Dubin Inquiry.
About the psychology of air control.
No, I read much of the stuff on the Dubin Inquiry on the lack of air safety.
Yeah.
Have you implemented many of its recommendations yet?
Well, the first recommendation is the creation of an independent body for the purpose of inquiry, and that is being done. I've already announced that. The legislation should be in the House sometime in the new year.
Mind you, if you want anything done in government, one has got to do what you did in VIA, is take the decision at cabinet level.
Thank you.
Is that not correct?
Well, you know, that's one way. That's one way. I didn't like it particularly. It's just because I thought, really, first, the law authorized me to do that. Second, there was no other way. Because what I would have had to do, Jack, would have had to say to the to the CTC, the Transport Commission, look, this is the money you have, and the chances of them, and I would have been chastised for that as much as I'm chastised now. People that have said, look, he's taken away the autonomy of that commission, he's downgraded to the point where he tells them what to do. So I had no choice, really. I'm going to be damned now. I'm being damned by some people, but I'm being damned for a good purpose, because results are going to follow.
2 points, then I've got to let you go because they're picking you up. You didn't come by rail, did you?
No.
You didn't?
No.
You came in a plane?
I came in your car.
I'm from... Now, a question I simply must ask you, though, is you are the architect and the controller of wage and price controls. Would you concede that we have a major crisis in this country today on rampant inflation, people's mortgages payments being doubled? Would you concede that there is, in effect, nothing, including wage and price controls, that can be done to protect the ordinary person with today's fearsome problems?
You know very well that I can't answer this question at this time. But there's a cabinet solidarity business. But what I can tell you, though, is my experience as a controller. You know, as a controller. And I think the years the commission, the Anti-Inflation Board existed, are being looked upon now by people as rather good. I don't know if I should say that.
A breathing space.
I don't know, yes. But not as the normal situation in a country. The reason why I think people look favorably upon what we at the Anti-Inflation Board did was that we did it in a balanced, in a flexible way. We had those rules, those regulations, those guidelines, but there's no set of guidelines existing anywhere this side of heaven or hell which will take you through an anti-inflation period. There's no guidelines, because you could very well be creating damage greater than the problems that you're trying to solve. The reason why we came out with a fairly good reputation was that the Anti-Inflation Board was balanced and did not create unnecessary problems. And I think we were beneficial, but I don't think this is an institution to be consecrated as a normal practice in a country.
Are you worried about the situation?
Am I?
The economics of the nation?
Certainly, everybody should.
Can't get any better, can it?
It can't get any better, oh yes. Well, we're in a funny situation. On certain sides of our economy, the interest rates, for example, are pretty bad. But alongside, on the other side of that, the elements of growth that you have in this country at this time, you know, the major projects that are ahead in terms of gas and oil and coal, for example, the coal development on the West Coast is fantastic. I mean, in any country of the world, the press would be full of these major developments, right? But in Canada, it happens all the time. So again, on transportation, look, in the next decade, the CN and the CP are going to invest $16 billion in transportation equipment in Canada, improvement in Canada, 75% of it in the West. It's fabulous. So while we are not in the best of economic circumstances, interest-wise and value of dollar-wise and whatnot, this country is really a great place in terms of the economic development that are ahead for us.
Give me a brief answer on this?
Yes.
Does the constitutional decision at this particular crisis in our life really matter at all?
Well, I hope that
in the short run.
I hope it is favorable to the government, obviously.
Yeah, but I mean, it's not a matter we're waking up in the morning worrying about.
There's been so many things said about this government last year's obsession with the Constitution and whatnot. No. It has never been that much of an obsession. Come on now. My department, transport, industry, trade and commerce, regional development, all these departments worked like hell last year to build up the economic structure.
How long in politics? How long in politics?
Me? Since 1963.
That's 18 years.
Yes.
I hear a little whisper that you'll make
But I have been absent for a while.
I hear, yeah, you were out, Jean Pickett beat you.
Yeah, no, she didn't beat me.
Who beat you?
I was the member, Creditis. Don't you remember 1972? I lost in the massive election by 13 votes. One of the reasons was that I was the author of the textile policy. You remember the textile policy, which is reproduced now?
One shouldn't do this on the air, but you're looking forward to your job as ambassador from Canada to Japan?
Is that true? is that news? No, no, I'm not looking forward to ambassadorship. I'm looking forward to a good, small number of good years as Minister of Transport, giving it all I have.
My thanks to Jean-Luc Pepin.
Thank you, Jack.
It's good to be back in politics. I mean, for me, I've been off for 4 or 5 months. Next, Jean Piggott. Tory. Terrible Tory. Jeannie going.
You see, that's so smooth. So smooth. Oh, yes.
We'll run in this direction. Jean Piggott was a distinguished Tory member of the House of Commons. Well, for a while. I mean, how long were you in there?
29 months. 7 months with the Prime Minister's office and 7 months walking the streets of Ottawa in 3 elections. I'm known as the best-known streetwalker in Ottawa.
And you deserve a little praise, too, because you opened the books to the party appointments. If you can call, let's call them patronage appointments.
That's right.
You opened the books and we could walk in and say, okay, Joe Schnarf has been given a job on some board. How much are you paying him and for how long, correct?
That's right. It was the first time in history that the total Order and Council appointments, including the boards of directors of all Crown agencies, were open to the general public, to the press, to see who the appointment, length of time, salary range, and under what act the appointment was made.
See, one arose yesterday, I think it was in the local paper, I presume it's right, Ian Howard, who used to work with Monroe, is now running a company which is winding up Lotto Canada, and he refused to tell the reporter how much he's getting on a per diem. He's got a small staff wiping up the Lotto Canada surpluses. In your day, we would have known.
Yes, I think this is important and it's one of the bits of accountability that we have to bring back into the system, Jack, is that these things should be tabled, should be open and above board. I mean, the taxpayer deserves that kind of accountability.
It didn't take the Liberals long to close the door, did it?
Yes, they've closed it completely.
Just 2 minutes after you were out, wham, that was the end of it.
But you know, I've seen to it that certain of their national companies who are in the media business are keeping those books up to date. Mm-hmm. They go after every cabinet meeting and note what's happening, because unfortunately I can't do it anymore.
Jean Piggott, Joe, the night of the long knives is not far away for Joe Clark. Would you agree with at least part of that statement? Because the knives are out for Joe, and he stood up to them in Ottawa the other day. Was it in Ottawa?
Yes.
Yeah, and he said, I'm going to stay. Can you interpret for me his brutal reshuffling of his shadow cabinet, the downgrading of Crosby, etc., from finance to external affairs, for instance?
Well, now remember, I'm a defeated candidate. I'm a delegate at any appointments. So I speak completely as Jean Piggott, citizen.
That's why I'm asking you, because you're free to speak.
I think the thing that you have to recognize is the reality of the situation is Mr. Trudeau is there as Prime Minister. The Liberals are in for another 2.5 years. And so the Tory party must be very wise and very careful at this point to do what we are supposed to do, which is to be Her Majesty's loyal opposition. We must zero in constantly with Mr. Trudeau and that front bench to see that they're accountable for the certain messes that we are in. It was Joe Clark last year who was the single person who stood up on the Constitution. Gradually, people began to recognize what he was saying, even his own party. Now, thank God for that, because I think that decision may be a split one, and maybe we'll still have time to work on our Constitution in Canada and make it a right one. And thanks be to Joe Clark's leadership. And I think the party must be very careful at this point that we've been talking now about economics. The main thing in these next days is what are we going to do on economic policy, inflation. What are we going to do about this? There's hundreds of people being deeply affected by these interest rates.
Thousands and thousands and thousands.
30,000 homes. Think of the thousands of economic decisions that are being made now till Christmas time as people decide whether they're going to save their home or what they're going to do. We must keep our attention not on leadership. Joe has another year and a half. Now, when he reshuffled his cabinet, some of those reshufflings were very good. I mean, John had been in
finance.
you know, it's a good thing for him now to be an external. It's a good. I mean, if I had a football team, I'd move some of my people around. I think it was a very good thing to do.
But it can be properly interpreted as a downgrading of potential leadership competition if you take them away from the prime positions in the front bench and reduce them.
Well, I don't know. External affairs and the whole North-South. I think we're in very serious trouble with our friends in Washington over some of our economic policies, especially the NEP program. And John will be addressing all the issues in external affairs that affect us with the Americans. That's terribly important, Jack.
But don't you waking up some nights and think, oh my God, why will... Baker, of course, was moved from being House Leader.
Yes.
Loses his $15,000 a year. I suppose he was the architect of that ill-considered vote which led to your defeat after 9 short months.
Jack, we made some mistakes. Make no bones about it. But let me tell you, as long as we learn from them, that's the most important thing for the Tories. Now you're going to talk about my favorite subject at the moment.
It says here, full participation and equality.
For the
For what?
disabled. For the disabled. This year I have been working. You know, when you're unemployed after having a political career, you have to do something.
Oh, you had a thriving family business.
Oh, yes, I know, but I turned it over to my sister, you see, so you can't very well say, kid, sister, move over, here I come. So she made me chairman of the board. And after 6 weeks of being chairman of the board, I learned you get a corner office with a beautiful view and an antique desk, and not a heck of a lot to do, Jack. So I decided I had to do some other things, and I started to be a consultant. And you know what's fun about being a consultant?
You get paid.
Well, you tell people what to do, and Arthur, my good husband, tells me I've always loved telling people what to do. I get paid, and I don't have to implement it, and that's the fun part. Anyway, I was given an assignment by the Coordinating Committee of the Year of Disabled. There were 3 of us chosen to knock on the doors of the top 500 corporations in Canada whose head off, who really, let me say, control most of the job.
Decision makers.
Keith Spicer takes care of the West. The famous Dr. Jean Gras doing the East, and I was given Ontario. And at the moment, I have knocked on the doors of presidents of 160 corporations in Ontario.
What are you looking for? Money?
No money, not even commitment. What I'm trying to help them is, do they have equal opportunity programs for the disabled? And you know, it's amazing. There's only about 15% of the corporations in this country have ever addressed this. The rest of it realize it's coming if we have our human rights legislation, and many of them have never thought about things like access, AIDS, but more importantly, attitudes. Is there an attitude in their corporation where they would employ a person in a wheelchair, or a person with a hearing aid, or a person who has had epilepsy, those kinds of things. And now for example, one large corporation, take the Molson Company this week. I have been back now with my films. I have seen the 10 vice presidents of Molson's in a room talking with them about their attitudes. And you know, most Canadians, especially after this incredible year with your Terry Fox, you know, your Terry Fox has made my role so much easier because people have suddenly recognized that behind the steel leg, there was a man.
This may have been his biggest contribution of all.
His biggest contribution. You can't believe what that young man has done, because he's made Canadians, so often what we've done with disabled or people that have been imperfect, we have shunted them aside.
More with Jean Piggott. I haven't done anything on the International Year of the Disabled, so this is as good a time as any to make a bout. Take phones on it too if you want, after the break. Jean Piggott is working for the International Year of the Disabled as a consultant, right? To tackle the big companies in Ontario. Your territory is
That's right.
500 companies in Ontario. Looking around British Columbia, we've made great strides in questions of physical access, elevators and whatnot. Are we ahead or behind the rest of the country?
You've done very well here, but we must keep the pressure on because that's one of the hardest things is access. But more particular is attitudes. Attitudes to the personnel director sitting behind the desk faced with employing a able-bodied person or someone with a disabled. How does he make that decision?
But when you go in, do you get a warm response, and does the man say, well, look, certainly we can find a place for a half a dozen token disabled?
That's
I mean,
not what
that
you
would
want.
probably be the reaction of most guys. I've got to get this Piggott woman off my back. I've got to mend my PR image, and I can get little things in the company magazine about somebody at wheelchairs, or blind people, of course, are terribly skilled in minute things. Is that not the attitude, to get you off their back?
Oh, yes, with some people. But on the other hand...
Even that's a help.
Even that's help. I don't mind that. But remember that one of the things facing them is the equal opportunity. It is the fact that in the human rights legislation, the disabled will be a part of it. But what I go after them, you see, the most important thing to remember about this whole area is 60% of the 10% who are disabled in this country are employable. There's 10% disabled in Canada.
What do you mean, 10% of 24 million?
Yes, are disabled.
You're not talking about age or
No.
normal infirmities.
I'm talking about people who, well, that's, the aged are not in there. I'm
No.
just talking about people with disabilities, people who cannot fully participate in the economic and social life of their country because of access or training, etc.
How do we treat them in terms of social legislation in the ways of money? For instance, we've got a disabled pension of a kind, which comes from the provincial government.
Well,
do we treat them well?
Well, of course, all pensions today with inflation, it's very tough.
Disastrous.
But the most important thing is that these people could be employed. And that's the thing. You see, getting a job means that you begin to be a contributor again and a consumer again. That's why I'm interested in this program. If we can take people who could be employed in part-time, flexible, or full-time employee, that means they're taxpayers again, they're consumers, they're back in the mainstream. And that's what the whole program is about, getting jobs for these people.
But we have a massive problem in this country right now of attempting very poorly to retrain people who want to get out of their ordinary jobs and get back for technique. We've got a vocational school here that has got is using 1/3 of its capacity to retrain people. The other 2/3 is empty.
Well, Jack, that's terribly sad, because that's one of the things
The apprenticeship scheme in this country is run largely by the influence of the unions and civil servants. We're not producing people, even able-bodied people.
The challenge in the 80s in the human resource area is for training, for upgrading skills.
Do you find there's an optimism in this country or a pessimism? I know in certain areas the mortgage crunch is creating an awful lot of pessimism and could lead, some say, to social chaos.
All right, let's take, basically, I believe Canadians feel that they're living in a land of great promise, great future. They are distressed, deeply distressed, by some of the economic decisions made by our politicians and the government that happens to be in power now. You were right in the earlier program. The government was preoccupied in the past 18 months with the Constitution and not addressing the basic economic factors in this country. And now we're beginning to reap the problems. I personally believe, you know, Joe Clark was right with mortgage interest deductibility. I'm sorry, he was right. If that program hadn't been in place right now, it would have been...
Joe Clark is a living proof that if you try to be honest and straightforward with the public, you'll get your throat cut. He said, I'm going to put 18 cents on gas. The price of gas is going to go up. I'm close to an agreement with Lougheed, right?
That's right.
He said, I'm going to give you mortgage deductibility.
That's right.
And what happened?
And we would have had the compensation programs on energy for the people who are going to be so badly hurt. That is on heating oil and on certain rail areas. That would have been in place right now. All right. The Canadian people
made their choice.
They made their choice, and that's what it's all about.
Yeah, it's a shame, though, that the man who becomes Prime Minister of Canada must be a man who can be, what's the word, merchandised.
Yes, that's one of the problems. But on the other hand, the other problem, very simply, we have got to recognize that our parties have become polarized regionally. And you have the person that will become Prime Minister of Canada has to win in Ontario. And the policies were aimed at the Ontario politicians, and that's one of the tough things today.
You don't think Joe will step down under pressure with the knives in his back from the Ontario people or elsewhere? I mean, I keep thinking of old Smooth Mulrooney, who's charming and bilingual as Trudeau is. And I think of Wee Crombie with his aims and aspirations, legitimate ones. I'm not saying he's a backstabber.
But isn't it wonderful our party's got so many good candidates? I mean, that's one of the great things about our party. We've got great talent. But let me tell you, I happen to still believe in Joe Clark saying, he said one thing, and I believed him. He said, when the time comes, if I cannot win the country, I will step down. Now, I believe that man. At this particular point, he's right in the fact that the main problem at the moment is to keep the heat on the present government.
Let's have a session on the phones with Jean Piggott from Ottawa on the International Year or on Tory politics, because Joe's coming here soon, I think, all being well, after the break.
We've done
Well, that's a bloody change.
we always have.
Calls to Jean Piggott, and we'll just go straight to the phones. Jeannie.
Jeannie, I always get called Jeannie.
I call you Jeannie.
Well, my father always called me. That's the Scottish.
That's right.
Yeah.
Go ahead, please.
Yes, Jack, we're glad to have you back. By God, we are.
Good.
Since you've been away, we've been through the mill here, and you've got the picture now, and you've touched a nerve already this morning.
Okay.
To your distinguished guest, I have a remark. The Conservatives are getting ready for their spring convention. This will be a bloodbath in which Clark will be fed to the wolves. Bay Street is courting Mulroney, but he would be a supreme idiot if he gave up the presidency of the Iron Ore County of Canada to run for a party that is notorious for eating its own young.
Well, you've got that written down, and it's standard material, but it's good. Jeannie,
It's coming right out of my head. I know the words.
I'll find you a job.
Both opposition parties will use the question period to gain a little mileage out of the mortgage rates and energy and the general chaos and inflation in the system. They'll all have egg on their faces after getting their brand new pay raises with their noses deep in the trough. Cosset will dig up a little dirt.
That's enough.
And Crosby will give us a few newfie homilies, while Broadbent will mutter idle threats about Bowie in the Bank of Canada and the oil company.
Now, give me a chance. Now, come on,
It is
give me
too
a chance.
cynical
Now.
to wonder why hold the session at all.
Why don't you run for Parliament?
And after all,
Oh.
as Legrand Pierre has often stated, the world is unfolding as it should.
Okay. Magnificent little peroration there.
And
Jean.
I believe he has already made reservations to spend Christmas in the
It's
Bahamas.
my turn.
One comforting thought, Mrs.
It's
Piggott,
my
and
turn.
I
Come
admire
on
you
now.
greatly. I think you're a wonderful woman. One
Now,
comforting
thank you very much, but now give me a chance now.
we have the most valuable politicians in the world.
Enough. Carry on, Jean.
Everyone has his price.
Here. Go ahead, please.
Oh, isn't he great? You know, he's so glad you're back on the air so he can give vent to all that. Now, listen, good sir. The main problem at the moment is Mr. Trudeau and the Liberal government.
Here. Go ahead, please.
Hello?
Yes, ma'am.
I just wanted to say, Jean Pickett, I think I really thank you very much for saying what we've been trying to say in the West for a long time to Mr. Trudeau, who does not listen to anything that we have to say. And I'm very upset. I feel that we've been left back here. We're not being noticed or recognized here in the West. And I just hope, hope that this lady will keep on fighting for this side.
Thank you, ma'am.
Madam, she's perfectly right. One of the great challenges in the country at the moment is how do we listen more to the West?
Go ahead, please. Hello.
Hello, there it is. Down.
Speak up.
Hello, Jack.
Yeah.
Can I address the question to Jean?
That's why
Hello?
she's here.
Jean, what's the federal government's record on employing disabled people?
Unemployment of disabled?
Yep.
Well, I have to say that there has been a very good task force working in the federal service itself on equal opportunity for disabled. We must continue to keep pressure on the government to open up specific areas. They're doing a great deal, especially, for example, in the area of people who are retarded, who are slightly retarded. We have had a real employment strategy and some great success stories.
In the federal government?
In the federal government. Now, the whole emphasis this year has been, of course, on the Year of the Disabled and setting up the equal opportunity programs. But we will be monitoring it as time goes on. The other thing, too, of course, is to keep an emphasis on how do you find the disabled? How do we find a central agency that can do it? And so the great work now will be in the employment area.
Thank you. Go ahead, please, from Nelson.
Yes, Jack. The Constitution that Ms. Piggott and yourself were saying that was the preoccupation of the Liberals last year, certainly two of those plans for the new Constitution are tied in with the economy. And we can't divorce these two issues and pretend that they don't exist.
That's right.
I mean, it seems to me that the only reason he came to the bargaining table low heat is because the courts had not made a decision on this.
Good point.
Good point.
Before the new budget came down.
Good point.
You know, one of the things I felt like in last year's discussions on the Constitution, very often we didn't talk about the economic fallout of many of those decisions. We talked about the legal standpoint, but we often didn't talk about how it was going to affect the economy of the country in the long run.
Surely that's the most important part about the Constitution that Trudeau's trying to push through, especially its results for Western Canada.
And you don't write constitutions in a hurry.
Go ahead from Terrace.
Yes, hello, Jean.
Hello.
Thank you very much for the good work you're doing. I'm one of the disabled that has cost taxpayers in the last 3 years about $50,000, mainly because of lack of communication, bureaucracy, and dealing with Public Service Commission, Workers' Compensation Board, Occupational Health, personnel offices, insurance companies, lack of retraining programs, and along with human resources.
That's right.
And I am perfectly able to go to work. But on certain jobs that I apply for, I'm literally told, no, you can't take it.
Is it because mainly of attitudes or access?
It's total lack of communication. As an example, WCB does not notify occupational health what their findings are. In one particular instance, WCB said, you can't go back to work in that job, and next week I got a letter from occupational health saying that you must return to that job.
You are right. We have not yet built what I call an effective, efficient network out there to help people. It has to be coordinated.
I was always a pretty good wage earner.
How old are you?
And I'm 55.
What's your disability?
It's a leg.
Bad leg?
Just one leg, yeah. But the thing is, I've received approximately $50,000, and that's an awful lot from the taxpayers.
That's right. That's right. And
it irritates me.
But thank goodness for your attitude, because your attitude is that you want to go back to work. You want to be a contributor and a consumer again.
And in my
don't let that die in your soul while we work out the.
No way. Anyway.
Okay, sir. Much obliged. Go ahead, please.
Morning, Jack.
Morning.
Just wanted to talk about the Year of the Disabled too. From a society in Port Coquitlam, I think you know us quite well, Jack. And we were turned down both federally and provincially for the Year of the Disabled.
For a grant?
For a grant, yeah.
For your workshop?
We've been, it's Second Step Society, you know.
Right.
You know our society.
Yeah, I know you.
Struggling for 3.5 years without any help at all, and we were turned down by both the Year of the Disabled federally and provincially. So what do you think about that?
Well, madam, I have to tell you there were thousands of requests, and there was $2 million at the federal level. Now, part of that is I think the federal government should have given more, but on the other hand, you know, we live in a time of restraint. We've got to make these societies cost effective, and there are ways to help you. I wish I had time to talk about your particular.
We have no help whatsoever. You know, I mean, we're parents who started this society.
Done a very good job indeed. Really quite a fantastic job, but everybody's cutting back on these.
Oh, I know. It's very difficult.
Love, thanks for calling. My thanks to Jean Piggott. Next, we're going to do Paul Hellyer on exit inflation. I hope he's got the answers after the break. We go tight. I hate that shot of me, Ruben, sitting like this like a fat pig.
Excuse me, are you going to get the chain?
Am I what?
You're going to get the chain before 3 o'clock?
He's going to get the chain. Remind him. Gladys, you phone the bank.
15 seconds, Jack.
One thing that Paul Hellyer is, he's practical. Highly successful businessman in his own right. Moved into the Defense Department, the Liberal government, and did things. Many people still don't like them, but he did them. And then he's written a book now which really has, Paul, has it not, an arrogant title, Exit Inflation.
It may sound so, Jack. I didn't write the title, but I like it because it catches people's attention, and that's really the purpose of a book title.
It's not an easy book to read.
No.
Because the first part of the book is, you know, one tends to agree with the facts you present, but then you say at the end, and this is where I agree with you, we must have an incomes policy to narrow the gap between the workers at the bottom and their more fortunate brothers, or accept a class system where the majority earn more than enough and the working poor never will.
That's true, Jack. Something drastic has to be done.
Do you think if we go on the present course of, what do you call it, runaway inflation, up and down like a roller coaster, that it could, in the near future, lead to social chaos, if not anarchy?
Well, it depends what you mean in the near future. The problem with inflation is you never know how far it's going to go. And, you know, a few years ago it was 2 or 3%, and went up to 5 or 6, and went up to 15 for a while and bounced back down, and now it's on the climb again. And it could, if we don't do something about it, go to hyperinflation at some stage, and probably a collapse of our monetary system. Or on the other hand, if they keep on with this monetarism and screwing the money supply as they're doing in Canada and the UK and Britain, we could have another depression, and that would lead to social chaos and anarchy in the streets.
But we can't have another depression, can we, because of that possibility?
For 30 years I've been saying it was impossible. I didn't think we were that stupid. I thought we had learned enough to avoid doing anything like that, but as frankly, Jack, after reading the papers the last few weeks and listening to some of the experts in the United States and Canada and elsewhere, I think anything could happen, and I'm really depressed about their, well, you know, going along the same old route.
But even at that, you can take Israel or some of the South American countries, but Israel particularly, where they faced 125% inflation in 1 year, but survived on the face of it.
Yes, there are cases where you can do it for a while, but then you can get into the situation as you did in the Weimar Republic in Germany, where eventually it collapses. And even in South America now, where you have hyperinflation, you get people getting paid, in some cases daily, and going out to spend their money in a coffee break, because it won't be as much as if they wait until later in the day or until the next day. And this is no way to live,
Isn't
Jack.
that
This
what
is
some
hopeless.
people, the lucky ones in this society who are managing to meet their mortgage payments and have something left over, isn't that what they're doing right now?
Well, everybody's trying to keep their head above water, Jack, and reading the weekend papers in Vancouver and seeing what's happening to some of the young homeowners who are trying to keep their heads above water in the face of a 100% increase in mortgage payments. It is just heartbreaking.
Are our expectations of affluence, by that I'm talking about the people on the lower end of the income scale, are our expectations of affluence too great? Have we been spoiled rotten?
Jack, our expectations are not too high, but our performance is abominable. We're not producing more at the moment, which is the reason that our real wages are going down instead of up. And you said at the outset of the program, you may not believe that there's a cure for inflation. 99% of the people may not. And this is part of the problem, getting them to believe that something can be done.
You give the history of the orthodox economists, Freeman and company. Why can't their system of high interest rates and restriction in some ways of development.
The money supply?
Well, the money supply.
Yeah.
Why can that not work? That's the classic way to handle it.
Okay, monetarism cannot work, Jack, because it assumes that at some level of misery, and you know what the misery level is, it's a combination of the unemployment rate and the inflation rate. Mm-hmm. At some level of misery, that industry and labor will moderate its claims. Now that's what it assumes. By tightening the money supply and raising interest rates, that all of a sudden business and labor are going to say, okay, we're going to stop this cycle and stop this rat race and come back to reason. So what I say in the book is that if you are going to take Mr. Bowie, Mr. McKechnie, Mrs. Thatcher, Mr. Friedman, most of the professors in our country seriously, if you're going to take them seriously, Jack, you have to believe that in 1 year or 2 or 10, that the steel workers and the Teamsters are going to walk in and say, well, we're going to settle for 2% a year for the next 2 years.
No way.
Because we think that's about what productivity is going to be. And some of the building trades are going to come in and say, well, we're going to take a 2-year contract at 1% a year because the people in minimum wages have been getting it in the short for a while, and we want to see them have a little break, so we'll settle a 3-year contract for 1% a year.
No way.
Well, if you don't believe that, and I don't, then what is being done in Canada, the United States, and Britain is insanity, because it will never solve inflation in 100 years. And we just keep going on and on and on, and heaven only knows.
Before we
where it
come
will
to
end.
the cure, can we live with inflation? I mean, if everyone is inflated, from the old age pension and disabled pension and upwards, can you live with it?
Jack, if you could index it for everybody 100%, theoretically, yes. You know, if you could say, we're going to have 8% inflation, that's all we're going to have. So you index old age pensions, and you index mortgages, and you index salaries, and you index annuities, and you index everything, theoretically, apart from the fact that it's ridiculously complicated. Yes, you could live with it. But you can't guarantee it's going to be 8, because as soon as you got it indexed at 8, somebody's going to come along and get a bigger settlement, and the thing is going to go up to 10 or 12%, and your whole system breaks down.
Is it possible to ask you to spell out 1, 2, 3, what you think must be done?
Yeah. Jack, first of all, most of the analyses of what has gone wrong, in my opinion, are substantially incorrect. Government deficits, influence from outside Canada, oil prices, going off the gold standard, all of these things, you know, in some cases you can find a scintilla of truth, a little bit, but substantially incorrect. The reason we have inflation in the Western world today is that for the last 15 years in particular, Jack, since about the mid-60s, wages have been rising faster than productivity. And then wages and prices have chased themselves up the spiral. And you went first to about 3 or 4% wage increases, and then 6 or 7, and then 10, and now 13, 12 or 13. And because labor unit costs are going up, prices are going up, and the thing goes around and round in a circle.
Just one question of clarification before we take a break. You say wages and prices going up faster than productivity. Wages, prices, including profits.
It's all part of the same bundle because the thing is all tied together in a big ball of wax, but profits have been going down as a percentage of total national product.
The cure to exit inflation after the break with Paul Hellyer. I don't know, the light seems to be much harsher. For instance, Jeannie's a good-looking woman, and she looked there like a... Yeah, what else can I look at? She looked like an ugly monster from outer space this morning. I don't say that in my unkind manner. I think she's a good-looking woman.
Pretty good, Jack.
Yeah, I thought she
On camera.
She looked nice to me.
Yeah, but no, I'm talking about the camera shot. I'm not talking about Jeannie.
Yeah, the monitor's not set up properly.
Well, for Christ's sake, let's get one that's set up. Can we do that? Make a difference. Paul Hellyer, on his book Exit Inflation, puts it very succinctly. It's here because wages and prices go up higher than productivity. Now the cure.
Jack, just one more word on the sort of overall view. Macroeconomics is not...
What's macroeconomics?
Well, it is wages and prices, the whole thing, the bundle. Is not complicated as some economists try and make it. You don't need to know calculus. You need a good grasp of grade 6 arithmetic. And you just put it simply if you want to understand it. If you and I and the Teamsters and the woodworkers and the civil servants and everybody else want to get paid 15% more next year for doing about the same amount of work we're doing this year, there's only one way we can get it, and that's to print the money. Now that's inflation. That's where it comes from, and that's what happens. You can only get that kind of phony wage increase by printing the money, and that's where that's inflation.
That's what we're doing now.
That's what we've been doing.
I've got that.
Okay, now as far as the cure is concerned, it's got to be drastic, and this is a change from what I was writing years ago because the situation is worse. And I recommend a 2-step cure. The first step, Jack, is a 15-month wage and price freeze. Zap. Everything frozen, wages and prices both, except for a few things like coffee and lettuce and tomatoes and internationally traded commodities which you cannot control. There's no sense trying to do the impossible, but you freeze wages and prices and stop the cycle. Now, why 15 months? Theoretically, it would only take 12 because labor unit costs stop going up right away, and so everything stabilizes. But we measure inflation year to year, so it takes a year to get it out of the system. So at the end of 1 month, you maybe have 11% inflation, then 10, then 9, then 8. At the end of a year, you should have it down to 0. Now, I've put in 3 months extra because I think we need a little bit of insurance against what we know is going to happen in gasoline and oil. We know that gasoline and oil are going to push up prices about 2 or 2.5%. So I've added 3 months extra productivity to offset that jump in gas and oil.
And then what?
Stage 2, at the end of that, to keep it from starting all over again, because there's no sense going through that sort of thing and then having the process, you know, start from ground one, go right back where you were, is a permanent incomes policy to control monopoly power. Now, monopoly power includes unions who have a monopoly supply of labor. Because they do, Jack. If the air traffic controllers walk out, you know, we just haven't got other air traffic controllers to replace them with. Or if the post office workers walk out, you could get people to sort mail cheaper than Jean-Claude Perrault's boys, but you can't because he has a monopoly supply. So you have to have a control of monopoly power on both the union side and the industry side to prevent wages being granted which are higher than productivity and then passing it on through to the consuming public. Now, it is in effect, in one sentence, to do the job that an anti-combines law was intended to do and has never done.
It's not wage and price control and incomes policy.
No, it is not.
First of all, it would be action by a federal government. Can a federal government take this drastic action to impose 15-month wage and price freeze?
If the Supreme Court will go along with declaration of state of emergency. If they don't, well, they did the last time. If they don't, then you have to use the Income Tax Acts and the Corporation Tax Acts to do it, but better to go and get the cooperation of the provinces.
Let me get that. You say the last time in the wage in Jean-Luc Pepin's board, they had to get the Supreme Court of Canada to say it was a state of emergency.
Yeah, they did. It was appealed to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled.
Half as bad then as it is now.
I know. That's the reason you would expect the Supreme Court to back them up.
So again. 1, the state of emergency. 2, the House of Commons imposes the 15-month wage and price freeze.
Right.
And following that, the incomes policy to control monopoly power. I don't quite understand that one. In other words, a government board would say, okay, you no longer have a monopoly?
No, what would happen is that each year in the tax law, you would say that where monopoly power exists, in other words, where a union contract exists, the package that's negotiated between the union and the company cannot exceed the average increase in productivity for the whole economy for the previous year.
Who would do this? The board?
Well, these measurements we have, Statistics Canada has.
Okay, one. You say
it would be in the budget, in effect.
You would say you only get your increase based on your increased productivity.
Yeah, you get your increase after you've increased the productivity.
What about the profits?
If the company is a monopoly or an oligopoly, and I treat them, you know, as one package, then their profits are limited on average to the long-term return on capital in that industry. And it's a...
Like a regulated public corporation, like a telephone company?
Something like that, yes. You know, the details I've said should be worked out during the 15 months to make sure that they've covered all the bases.
Has this been done effectively anywhere in the Western world?
It has never been tried on the basis that I'm recommending it, Jack. It's different. They've had incomes policies around the world. Some of them have worked for, you know, a while. It did in Australia for a number of years until it broke down. It did in Holland for a number of years until it broke down for reasons which I've described.
You have good tentacles into all the political parties. Do you have any encouragement that this might be adopted by somebody?
Jack, it won't be adopted by any political party until the people out there watching us, who are about to lose their houses or about to lose their farms or about to have their income cut in half because they've retired with $400 and find that it's buying less and less, really put on the pressure. Then and then only will some political party eventually say that they're going to do something.
2 stages, drastic, 15-month wage and price freeze.
Total freeze right across the board.
Incomes policy to control on a productivity basis and a profit basis monopolistic power.
Exactly.
Whether it's union or capital.
And that's important because You don't try to control where there's price competition. You don't control the little entrepreneurs, the little shopkeepers, and all the...
All right, now what about what Trudeau says with his great elegance and charm on every occasion? I'm not responsible for the world problems.
Well...
Interest rates I'm talking about.
To be fair, Jack, and you know, I think the political aspect of this is, well, you have to involve the political process to do something about it. I'm not looking for a scapegoat. I think in fairness, the politicians don't know what to do. They really don't. They're lost in a fog.
What would happen to interest rates during this period in Canada?
They would come down, Jack. If the whole Western world did it simultaneously, which is, you know, the thing that's not going to happen, but which would have been nice if it had happened, then interest rates all over the Western world would come down at the same time. But if we do it ahead of the United States, then instead of having to have interest rates 2 or 3 percentage points above theirs, we could go maybe to 3 or 4% below theirs and still not have an outflow of capital because we control our costs first. Canadian dollar would harden, and investors would look after inflation returns.
But as you have been on other occasions, Paul Hellyer, at this moment you're a lone voice in the wilderness.
Well, it's got to start somewhere, Jack. You've got to start peddling ideas and getting people interested and looking at them and taking the 4 or 5 hours that it really requires to read the book.
I know.
And then put on the pressure.
Your calls to Paul Hellyer after the break. Paul Hellyer writes columns in the Toronto Sun. A couple of short snappers. Trudeau's future.
No idea. I really don't. The gossip is that he may go sometime in the next year, maybe before the next election, but I wouldn't want to bet too much money on one way or the other.
Future.
Same thing. The knives are out, and they're going to have a meeting in Ontario in a couple of weeks, and they're going to go after him with a vengeance. But, Jack, I don't know how you can force a convention unless he agrees with it. If he's willing to ride along and just, you know, sit out the storm, I really don't know what to do.
The number one potential Trudeau successor?
Well, McEachern by default, if they don't call a convention and put him in, which is the plan. And I think the party may rebel at that, though, and then, of course, it opens it up for Turner and MacDonald and other
Clark's
people.
successor? How about Hellyer? Would he go back into politics?
No, I think Clark's successor will be either Davis or Lougheed, although certainly David Crombie and Mulroney and Crosby and others will be in the race.
Should be fascinating. Yeah. Go ahead from Kamloops to Paul Hellyer.
Yes, good morning. Question, Mr. Hellyer.
Good morning.
You stated earlier that wages have increased over the last 15 years, and this hasn't kept pace with productivity. In other words, implicitly what you're saying is people are being paid more money for producing the same amount of goods as they did 15 years ago.
Not the same amount as we did 15 years ago, but the wage increase year by year, with 4 or 5 exceptions, has been greater than well, first of all, the increase in prices, and about 10 times greater than the increase in productivity.
But how can people be encouraged or even produce more when they can't when the goods that are being produced can't even be sold? If you take the example of the aircraft manufacturing plant in Ontario, they've produced the planes, they can't sell them.
One of the reasons they can't sell what's being produced is because of this monetary policy that I was talking about. The cure for inflation is also the reason that we can't sell the stuff that we're producing now. They turn the money supply, and there isn't enough money available at unit prices, and this is the thing that most people don't understand. There isn't enough money available at the prices to buy the cars and the combines and the tractors that are being produced. I met a banker from Chicago the other day, and we were talking about inflation. He said, too much money chasing too few goods. Well, this is just absolutely ridiculous. The Loblaws, well, I don't want to get Eastern supermarkets out here, but the supermarkets are full of goods. The stores are full of goods. We've got tractors and combines and cars and trains coming out of our ears. And the thing is, we can't buy them all at what they cost. And that's because we've been going the wrong way about trying to cure inflation, which is by reducing the money supply instead of getting wages back in line with productivity so you can operate at full employment.
You don't anticipate any tax cuts Reagan style at the moment to help with this?
It doesn't help very much, Jack, if you still have a tight monetary policy. And the problem in the United States at the moment is that on the one hand, Mr. Reagan is cutting taxes and providing accelerated depreciation to get business to expand. On the other hand, he's squeezing the money supply to bring on a recession. And these two things cancel each other out. But so consequently, it doesn't make that much sense.
Very important point, though. In the States, correct me if I'm wrong, they have some free enterprise elasticity. Here, as we saw the other day, Canadian civil servants, God help us, get more than top American civil servants. Our civil servants have got great increases, indexed pensions.
Yes,
is that not one of the petards that's going to hoist us?
We're less private enterprise oriented than they are in the United States, and our civil service, I think, is less private enterprise oriented than it is in the United States. But getting back to inflation, that the root cause of inflation basically is the same in Australia and Canada and the United States and Britain and just about everywhere else in the
Thank you, ma'am. Go ahead to Paul Hellyer.
Good morning, Mr. Hellyer.
Good morning.
I agree. It's feasible. However, your concept has several drawbacks. One of them is automation. For an example, whereby the large companies could put in all these big machines, eliminate people from their jobs, and still, because of the investments, they can still get their money back. There's people being unemployed.
Well, actually, automation doesn't matter when you're looking at employment and inflation, in the sense that once you get inflation under control, you can expand the economy fast enough to provide jobs for those displaced workers. And some of the jobs that they're being taken over by robots are jobs I wouldn't want to do anyway. I wouldn't want to hold a spray paint all day over a car or something like this and breathe in the fumes. Some of those things are better done by robots. But as long as you have a monetarist approach to cure inflation, the jobs aren't there to absorb the workers. And this is the real problem. Once you go to a sensible kind of solution so that you can expand the economy, then when the workers are displaced by robots or automation, they can get, in many cases, cleaner, nicer jobs doing something else. And that's really what we want to do.
Go ahead, please.
Yes, Mr. Hellyer.
Good morning.
At what point could you freeze wages when you're not going to get total opposition from some unions, like what's happened this year with all the strikes?
You're going to get a lot of opposition, but I think you're going to get opposition mostly from union leaders once you have explained that everybody wins by what I'm proposing. Nobody loses.
Well, there's going to be some unions that are going to be behind already, like the BCGEU. They don't settle till next year.
Exactly, but there'll never be total equality. And in the book, if you get a copy and take a look at it, I propose something that you can adjust the discrepancies a little bit over the years. But if you wait for a day when everything is even Steven to do your freeze, you'll wait 1,000 years. It's never going to happen. You just got to freeze it and go with it and then worry about the inequalities later.
How do you measure the productivity of our vast armies of civil servants? Do you keep them down to the productivity's national level?
Well, actually, the service industries have the low productivity, and this includes the civil servants. You know, some of them are doing important jobs, but it also includes medical services and others. And we have to share. You know, you can't give people who are in petrochemicals, for example, 10% a year increase and expect the people who teach their kids at school to get none, or the postman who deliver their mail to get none. We have to average it out, and that's the reason that the guideline I'm suggesting is based on the average increase in productivity.
And this is in your incomes policy to control unions and monopolies.
That's right. In stage 2, that the incomes policy relates to average productivity. Now, this doesn't mean that you can't still have the kinds of people out there, you know, running up the system. Where there's price competition, there would be no controls. So if somebody could start their own company and make $1 million, as soon as they're making too much, someone would move in and try and reduce their profit margins by going into competition with them. It's just the biggies who really control wages and prices that you have to go after and set guidelines.
Go ahead to Paul Hellyer.
Hello?
Yep.
Well, it's wage and price control, but it's a fallacy from the point of view that simply that there isn't such a thing as price control effective. Never was in the previous wage and price controls placed in a few years ago. They don't control, they certainly don't control the housing market, the real estate moguls. They don't control the interest rates.
A very good point. He's got the drift. He has 15 seconds to answer.
Well, last time they started wheeling wages down and prices at 2% a year. It was hopeless. And then you had the big oil shock on top of that. That was doomed from the outset. I'm not proposing anything like that. And believe me, if you're interested in housing, you should be interested in what I'm proposing, because this is the only way on earth you'll ever get interest rates back down where the average person on a reasonable salary, or even one salary person, can buy a house. No other way.
My thanks to Paul Hellyer as he exit with exit inflation. I'll be back after the break. House building and mortgage problems tomorrow, as well as Don Mazankowski. And don't forget, you can see the Webster rebroadcast. I'm going too fast. on Czech, Channel 6, after News Hour final. It's good to be back. I'll tell you tomorrow when I'm going to play the Webster Boys. Be here tomorrow at 9 a.m. precisely.